Hello and welcome to the Future of Work and HR stream at CogX 2021. This stream is curated by the Institute of the Future of Work. This panel session will be looking at surveillance. As a lot of people moved to remote working last year, it's sort of been highlighted the emergence of new types of evaluation tools and metrics for workers. Now, this adoption can both help and hinder, as embracing digital technologies for collaboration allows for different types of work assessments, but has increased the possibility for worker surveillance. This panel session will be looking at Big Brother and Big Boss. Is surveillance in the workplace the new normal? We'll be joined by Abigail Gilbert, who is the principal researcher at the Institute of the Future of Work. Welcome, Abigail.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thank you for that introduction. So yeah, as Nimi said, this is a really exciting session on Big Brother and Big Boss, where we have an all-star panel to discuss the question, is surveillance in the workplace the new normal? And I suppose more importantly, if it is, what are we going to do about it? So as Nimi mentioned, I'm Abby Gilbert. I'm the principal researcher at the Institute for the Future of Work. And we found strong evidence of an acceleration in workplace surveillance through COVID across workers, both on their computers at home and among those who still travel to go to their workplace. So this begs the question, are new digital rights needed to prevent us from being eternally monitored, nudged and judged? So among the star cast that we have today, incredibly brilliant lineup, we have Andrew Pakes, who is the Director of Research at Prospect Union and one of the Deputy General Secretaries of the Union, which represents workers from across tech, specialist, engineering and professional roles. Andrew leads Prospect's work on tech, AI and digital rights and is a visiting fellow at the ESRC Digital Futures of Work Research Centre. As an excellent campaigner, as anybody who knows Andrew on or off Twitter will recognise, Andrew also serves on the board of the charity Stonewall. And obviously there are significant implications of these kind of surveillance technologies for equality, which perhaps we'll touch on today. We also have Carissa Valiz, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford. Carissa works on privacy, technology and moral and political philosophy and public policy. In addition to her significant and wide-reaching academic publications, Carissa also publishes articles in various broadsheet media outlets and wrote, as you should see now, Privacy is Power, which was out with Bantam Press in 2020, and is also the editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Digital Ethics. And last but by no means least, we have Ivana Bartoletti, who is the Director at Deloitte and Visiting Policy Fellow at the University of Oxford. Ivana is an internationally recognised thought leader in the field of responsible technology and author of An Artificial Revolution on Power, Politics and AI. Ivana also founded Women in AI, which I personally find to be an excellent network, resource and space for discussion and debate with peer education and learning. So thank you very much for doing that, Ivana. So to kick us off, I wondered whether we might go first to the sort of worker experience with yourself, Andrew, to ask, are technological developments such as AI leading to new forms of surveillance in the workplace or just an increase in old ones?
Well, thank you, Abby. I think there's a real link actually between the old world and the new world here. So we're talking a lot about surveillance and monitoring from what we've seen, particularly for people who've been working remotely. But actually, it's not new, is it? You can go back to, I think, Jeremy Bentham, the idea of the panopticon. There was a sense of, in capital, how the control and management of workers and what that looks like. And secondly, we're talking about it now, but actually we've all relied during this pandemic on the people who knock on our doors and hand us parcels and others. And this level of intrusive micromanagement has been around for quite a few years. And if you listen to campaigners, the work you've done looking at, say, warehousing or logistics, this isn't new. What I think we've seen in the last year is a real acceleration of that. And I suppose that leads me to two things I often think about in terms of worker experience. Firstly, the power of this technology and what it means, but secondly, how it's impacting on our privacy and rights. So we have seen, over the last year, undoubtedly, digital technology has kept us safe, connected, working from home, working remotely, or connected to colleagues elsewhere. But we do know there's mission creep. And there was a very stark survey in December last year which said 1 in 5 British companies are either using digital monitoring or planning to do so coming out of the pandemic. And to me, that's the thing we need to talk about. What is this technology? You know, managers, employers have a reasonable right to direct their workforce, but it's when it goes into that mission creep. And we've seen that with the level of software, which is now on laptops. When we're typing away, can do keystrokes. We've personally seen in our union the increase in wearable devices. We've seen task allocation software. It then gets into this whole discussion around what data is collected, who holds it, and what decisions are made off the back of that data. And I think, to me, that's the worrying point of it. So a clear example on, say, something like a wearable device. You know, there are lots of wearable devices in the UK which have existed for a long while, so chemicals or other things. Having a device on a high-vis jacket to enable 2 workers to stay socially distant, that seems quite fine. But there's also products on the market which collect that data and allow employers to see and track their workers in terms of their working for. Now, we'd very strongly say, if it's about keeping us socially distant, why does there need to be a database that can tell you who is meeting who is in proximity to who, and how long they're doing that? That just gets into a level of intrusion that I think is really worrying, and we need to talk about. Secondly, before I hand back to you, Abby, I think we've learned over the last year there's a changing nature of privacy. You know, when you're in an office, there's an expectation you can be viewed, interacted with by colleagues or workers. Putting that into the home, putting cameras into people's kitchens or spare rooms is something really, really different. Checking what websites I look like, that's really different. And what it's shown to me is this whole idea of privacy is a changing concept. What we knew 2 years ago is now very different to what we know today. And I think getting some of those rights, and that's really important, because if we want to make flexible working work for all workers, or as many as possible, and do that Build Back Better that people talked about, we've got to deal with the negatives of that. And there are worrying things. You know, people will not have the right home environment. People have a right to a private life. If me, as say, for instance, as a gay man, and I'm not out at work, if my camera's on, does that show something in my background about my family relationship or other things? It gives levels of intrusion we've not talked about enough to understand what should be declared to your employer, what do you have a right to keep private, and how is that used in a management process. And that's a whole huge set of issues. And what's really brilliant is we've got Carissa and Ivana on this, who are, I think, 2 of the best activist thinkers in this field for us.
Absolutely. And so I suppose picking up on that, it would be really interesting, Carissa, I suppose Andrew's touched on, I suppose, the changing concept of privacy, and and whether or not really these changes in power dynamics are new. But I suppose I wondered, it'd be interesting if you could touch on what the kind of sort of foundations are for principles about thinking about privacy, and what should be underpinning our approach to this.
Yeah, thank you. So I think privacy has been a very important value since we live in societies. There has always been an interest in not giving too much information to others, because the more other people have information about you, the more they can interfere with your life, the more they have power over you. And when we lived offline entirely, it was kind of more obvious how other people could use that information against you. So for instance, when you went to a job interview and somebody asked you if you plan to have kids anytime soon, it was kind of very obvious that the answer to that question might jeopardize whether you get the job or not. Now, today, exactly the same thing is happening. So there are data brokers who are trying to get that data off of you by inferring, depending on what you read or what you buy or what you've been searching for. And you might very well be discriminated against for exactly the same reasons. It's just that you never see it. It's not tangible, because from the moment that data gets collected to the moment it gets analyzed, and then a decision about you has been made about a job, maybe a year has passed, and you will never connect those dots, and you will never know that you have been discriminated against. So I think the concept of privacy has actually been very stable, not only throughout history, but throughout societies. And it's just how more or less we are sensitive to it and how aware of it we are. Of course, one thing that has changed a lot is the amount of data that we can have of people. We have never had this kind of amount of personal data on people, and how we can analyze it and what we can do to it. So that has changed a lot. And that has made us go from, maybe privacy isn't that important anymore, to, oh no, it's just as important as it used to be, and maybe even more important. also there's this aspect of privacy that has been neglected in the past few years, and its connection to power and to kind of collective enterprises and politics. And there was this narrative peddled by tech companies that was very useful for tech companies to say, well, privacy is just a personal preference, something individual, and if you have nothing to hide, you're not a criminal, then you'll be fine. You have no reason to protect your data. And now we're kind of relearning the value of privacy through bad experiences, unfortunately, when we get things like identity theft, extortion, but also when we feel really in the power of our employer, and we are very much aware that they're learning things about us that maybe it's not okay. And through this kind of learning experience, we are acknowledging again that privacy is actually first and foremost a collective enterprise and a political concern, and how in order to have a strong democracy and a strong citizenry and a strong workforce, we need to protect our privacy for each other. Because if I'm perfect at protecting my privacy, I'm super careful, but my colleagues around me and my friends around me aren't, I'm doomed, because they have data about me, they have photographs, they have emails, they have messages. So it's really, we need to work as a group. And then just finally, to echo what Andrew was saying, I'm really worried about this intrusion of the work into the home. It's not only that the distinction between private and public is becoming blurrier every second. I mean, we're bringing cameras and microphones into our bedrooms, into our living room. But it's also that there's no, when I start working and when I finish, you know, in the past, employers were able to surveil employees, but only while they were kind of in sight. But now it's all the time. It's our employers can know when we're checking our email, and if we saw an email and didn't respond, and they can know our location sometimes, no matter what day, what hour of the day it is. And that's something we really have to be careful with. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderfully articulated, and there's so much to sort of feed off the back of there. But I suppose drawing specifically on the point around the need to recognise that privacy can't be treated as an individual choice, and that there is this strong collective dimension to the outcomes of not taking privacy seriously, I suppose, in a data-driven era. I wondered if I could ask you, Ivana, because you also obviously centre the word power in the title of your book. What does a consideration of power mean in this context, and how does that link to this kind of individual collective question?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I just wanted to say it's great to be on this panel. I really wanted to say that it's great to be sort of talking about this issue, and I just want to praise the work that you are doing in really trying to understand what is sort of algorithmic management and work, and I think it's a crucial topic that we absolutely need to discuss. And Carissa, your work on privacy is incredible, and to sort of bring it. I mean, these issues, as you say, you know, they are becoming more mainstream because of what we've seen, especially with the pandemic. You know, we were building on the trends of datafication and surveillance that were already there, as you both said, but now it seems that we're building on those in ways that are becoming, I think, more dramatic for a lot of people. And Andrew, I just wanted to say thank you, because I mean, you're bringing, it's like convener of so many different things, and your work on the use, for example, data privacy impact assessment, and how we can use this as a collective and negotiation tool for employees and workers to be involved in this sort of in viewing data privacy as a sort of negotiation and deliberation between our subjects and actors involved is absolutely great. I think Carissa is totally right, you know, and Carissa, you ended on sort of the issue of power, and is absolutely right, because what is happening at the moment is this, you know, we are all in this sort of asymmetry of power, and I think this is the big characterization of the age we're in, is this asymmetry of power, and that it becomes even more strong with the introduction of machine learning and black box technologies, where it feels as if, you know, there's a lot of burdens on individuals and even workers who say, you have to understand, you know, there are these machines that make decisions for you, that survey you, that decide whether you get hired or not, or whether you're fired, or you know, or decide when you get a bonus. All these machines, you know, they do a number of things, and and it feels as if, you know, we still have this understanding. We need to understand them. We need to. And of course, it can't be like that. It can't be because not just because these machines operate in a very subtle way, but also it can't be because of the complexity around all this, and we still have this culture where the onus is very much on the individual, to having to understand, to having to decipher. We've seen this in privacy with the 3 pages or 5 pages legalistic privacy notices that nobody can read, and then people say, people don't care about privacy. And of course they do. Is that most of the time there is little choice, and most of the time it's very difficult to navigate throughout all of the information that are given. I think, to be honest, one of the key things that we have seen in over the last few months happening, and I'd love to hear Chris on this as well, is that with regards to privacy and privacy in the workplace, it's so I think, yes, what we've seen is something that's existed already. We've seen all this boosted with the trends that were there already, but we have also seen the use of new tools that are much more opaque, much more difficult to understand. I mean, correctly so, the European Artificial Intelligence Act has put these tools into the high risk category. I mean, there is a question whether, is that the use of these tools for monitoring, surveillance, performance, and all of this, whether these tools should be actually governed in another way, because they are so intrusive, they're so invasive, and they're so risky. Not just when they go wrong, when used AI, but when they go right, it's even more. It's even worse. So I think the main issue here, I think, that we've seen over recent months, we've seen sort of these issues becoming much more mainstream. But what we've seen, it's something that is, we have somehow moved from, there is this movement, I feel, to move from seeing privacy and privacy at work or privacy in the streets through facial recognition, all of this, from an individual right, which is hugely important, fantastically important, but to seeing this through the eyes of the collective, and more in particular, to see this through the eyes of race. And this is this has changed. If I look, for example, at issues like facial recognition, I got facial recognition through the eyes of privacy, to then meet a lot of people getting to this facial recognition through the eyes of race, which is better to an extent, because it really means that you're not talking about individual rights, you're talking about social justice. And this is a fantastic journey that I think, and I wonder, and to some extent, when we talk about the use of artificial intelligence and use of these tools in the workplace, we are in the need to make a similar journey. That what we're talking about is not just the individual right of the employer, is what we're talking about is the minimum work, and we're going down to what it means what it means to be a worker. What is the concept of labor, and what it means that as not just as an individual, but as a society, how we value labor and how we value work. And I think this is the step that is important for us all to make. And I think that, each of us in our own capacity, and Andrew in Prospect, I think this is the kind of narrative that we're really trying to push. It's not just about, how we safeguard. Yes, this is absolutely crucial, but it's about how we value work and labor in the age we live in.
Absolutely. And just to pick up on that point around this, I suppose, the transition in the discourse of recognizing that equality is, I suppose, the why, if we've got the what as the privacy. I just wanted to invite Andrew to, I suppose, talk about how this has been experienced in the workplace and what the kind of union response has been to this, perhaps touching on sort of TUC analysis.
Yeah, and unions are increasingly getting active in this space for ourselves. We've just completed a couple of weeks ago our first data bargaining course. So traditional things you'd expect a union to do around collective bargaining, around pay and conditions. I think we very much see data as being part of the terms and conditions of work. And we will assert, and we think the law is clear under GDPR, that workers have a right to be informed when surveillance and monitoring's happened, and we have a right to be consulted. If it's our data, if we are the data subjects, and that is, the law says around high risk, actually material harm or damage. So if this data is being used to make decisions about us, who gets promoted, who gets a bonus, which team is working hardest, then actually that is a clear space where we should assert rights. But that bigger conversation of power, I think, is really important in this. And we're already seeing that, data which is collected, say, for safety reasons during a pandemic, is now turning up in disciplinaries, it's turning up in performance reviews, it's turning up in different ways. And we'd question the lawful basis. If we're being informed that data is here to ensure that we are safe, what right is there then to be using that data to say, well, actually, you're not the ideal worker? Someone's working harder, and that's where employment choice is. And I think that's a really important set, and we're seeing that all the way through for that level of intrusion, how people are making decisions about us, who gets, who's on the up, who's on the down. And because that can seem intangible, because you then got decision-making processes which are out of sight, out of mind, people can often think it's not there. And I think that goes back to power, because it's actually about the power in a contractual relationship, which is work, the power of the data and how that's used, and then the power of employers or people who are procuring this. And that kind of puts us in this crossroads where power is coming across so many different ways. And what we've traditionally seen, I think, is, and I've said, I think GDPR is important, but there's a risk in this. And the risk is we fall into the trap of big tech and this tech determinism, that technology will always be the solution. Because if you solely view privacy as individual, then you're going to not see or obscure the reality of impacts on groups of people. And I always argue, if I'm being surveilled, I will not have this software on me as an individual. It will be on me because I'm a worker somewhere and on a group of workers. If we then look at the dimensions of how structural or institutional racism or sexism applies, that happens to groups of workers. So obviously, if someone is discriminated against, a racist act happens to an individual, but racist decision-making in AI will also happen to other people who may have similar characteristics of being black or brown. And I think it serves the power of the decision makers in the tech world to close us down into an individual conversation. It's about you and your rights, and it is, but we only exercise rights, as Carissa said, as citizens, as part of a good society, and we've got to open up some of those bigger discussions into it. And that to me means, the brilliant work you've been doing, Abby, about accountability and equality in algorithm decision making, that actually, we regard this as a privacy issue when it can be an equality issue, it can be an employment rights issue. And our trouble is technology is advancing so fast. Most of our employment rights legislation was built in the last century and was around physical harm or physical risk, people not tripping over wires, people not spilling molten chemicals on themselves. And what we haven't got our head around, what does managing harm and risk look like if it's out of sight and out of mind, the kind of intangible nature. And I think those concepts of human in the loop, accountability, power has to have a named person or set of persons behind it. Because if we can start to name who's responsible, then we can start to have conversations about accountability and what the boundaries of that about. And that's the missing bit in the work relationship and largely in civic society as well.
That makes complete sense, Andrew. And I suppose building on that, thinking about the kind of mention that's been made by yourself and also Ivana earlier around kind of the information asymmetries that characterize these relationships. Carissa, I wanted to ask you whether or not you think existing legislation does adequately protect workers from increasing surveillance and management functions. Before I perhaps then come on to ask Ivana to say some more about her take on the new AI Act and whether or not we have anything to learn from our EU partners. So over to you, Carissa.
Thank you. There are some laws that have been very important. The GDPR was really a historical advancement that cannot be underestimated. At the same time, it's very limited in various ways. One thing is, I think that was the best we could come up with at the time, given the pressures and given what we knew. I think that the legislators did a fantastic job. But it's obviously not enough because every week we have new scandals. So obviously we have to change some things. Part of what we have to change is just to implement the law better. One of the challenges of data is that it's very invisible and it's very hard to police. So we only learn about things that go wrong sometimes years after they have gone very, very wrong and they've broken many lives. And that's a problem. So one way to try to address that is we need more auditing in place. Right now, anyone can design an algorithm to do anything and set it loose into the world without thoroughly testing it. And nobody checks on it. It's just amazing. Your data can be used by dozens, hundreds of algorithms right now, and you have no idea. And that's wrong, and we need to change it. So there's a lot of work to be done. I'm pretty optimistic that a lot of people are thinking about this right now, and Europe in particular is taking a leadership role in thinking about how we regulate AI, because data is always going to be related to AI in this age. And in the context of work, there are a couple of things that worry me a lot. One is, we got sold the idea that machines were fantastic because they were gonna work for us. They were gonna do the work for us. And now we're actually learning that we're actually working for the machine instead of having the machines work for us. And that is a very troubling experience for many workers, because it's very dehumanizing. It sets standards that are not reasonable. It doesn't take into account our embodied experience, our mental well-being, all kinds of things. We are not machines. And instead of making the machines improve our human lives, we're kind of forcing people to work for the machines and as machines, and that's incredibly concerning. Another thing that worries me is our dependence on these systems that many times are actually quite insecure. And we've seen, like a few days ago, how half the internet went down because of one company had a glitch. And in the same way, our governments, our companies, everybody is relying on these services, on video conferencing and so on, and we have very little control over it, and it doesn't even enable us to fulfill our own duties. So for instance, I teach, and whenever I teach online, I would really like to make sure that I can guarantee the privacy of my students, and I can't if I rely on these companies that don't give me any kind of report or don't explain how they deal with data. So we're very much creating a relationship of dependence that is bad for democracy, and that we should think about it twice. And then finally, another concern is how in our effort to be effective and to put numbers on everything and to come up with ways of measuring everything, we are changing the nature of work in ways that might be detrimental. So for instance, if you want to you employ a journalist and you want to make sure they're productive, so you kind of count the number of words that they write. Of course, that makes sense for somebody who is an engineer maybe, and it's an intuitive notion. But if you're a writer, you know that most of the good work in writing is actually deleting words and not writing them. You write a lot of words so that then you can cut them down and be really, really precise and really. So we are changing the nature of work in ways that are leading us towards being less effective and being less good at our jobs just to be able to satisfy the machine.
I just want to bring in, thank you, Carissa. I just want to bring in a comment from someone in the audience just on the subject of words and the quantification, I suppose, and surveillance of work. From Jordan Seal, who mentioned that in one of the workplaces that he worked in, there was an employer watching him type from a screen monitor in another room. So this is sort of predates whatever kind of surveillance is now happening while we work from home. Who would shout at him through the wall for spelling words wrong. So I suppose it just demonstrates the myriad ways that these power dynamics play out and can be amplified by technology. And in the recent report that we conducted, the Amazonian published the Amazonian Era, which looked at, I suppose, the way that algorithmic systems are transforming work, and this kind of reduction of work to a series of tasks that can be represented in data format was a really clear narrative there, and the way that diminishes human agency and experience was certainly a very clear message that came from our empirical findings there. So I suppose that's you also touched there quite importantly on the role of algorithmic impact assessments, and I suppose the need for more collective auditing, and I suppose routes to kind of democratize the conversation about what these systems are doing and what that might mean. And building on that, I suppose I wanted to come and more generally to Ivana to think about whether or not Europe and their kind of advances of beginning this conversation are really engaging with those grisly aspects of tackling with power dynamics that are the product of AI at work.
Thank you. So it's not an easy question, but I think the first thing that I would like to say is that the European AI Act is a great first step. So regardless of the detail, I think it's really, really important to see some leadership in the sense that there is a recognition of the risks that some AI systems can sort of bring into this space. And therefore, they need to put some regulation, not regulation around artificial intelligence as such, but regulation around some of the risks and the use and the controls that are wrapped around this technology. And I think everybody was expecting the EU to do this because, to an extent, the European AI Act is based on the same principles of GDPR, which is accountability and sort of self-assessment. So it's very much around companies have to, the bulk of the legislation is about some AI systems that are banned. So, for example, saying to the Chinese social scoring model doesn't belong to the European tradition, but it's also based on high risk artificial intelligence, which is where either because they're already regulated at sort of areas such as medical devices or some sort of, or because within the spirit of the Act, they may pose risks to individuals. Some AI systems are considered high risk, and therefore there is a number of controls wrapped around them, and from sort of the data to the security and some other elements. And then there is sort of lower risk AI, which has a little less control. Now, I think regardless of what we think of detail, this is a really good step. And I think everybody was expecting the EU to do that. I think it's important to recognise that there are complexities. So, for example, the definition of artificial intelligence in the Act is quite vague. There are some things that are a little bit complex. So, for example, when the Act says, it talks about the sort of data sets, then there is the assumption that data sets can be perfect, which is very difficult. And also there are some complexities around the derogations for the on-time surveillance through the facial recognition, which I think need a little bit clarification. Nevertheless, it's a great first step. Now, and this follows on, I think, from what Carissa was saying, is that the problem with artificial intelligence is not that it brings harms that were not there before. Obviously, somebody could spy on you before the big data, combination of big data and algorithms and all of that. The big problem I have with these systems is how the systems are opaque, how the systems do not fall under current legislation. So, for example, the application on discrimination law is very difficult because the concept of fairness cuts across privacy law, non-discrimination law, picks up goes on consumer legislation, so it's difficult. There is no sort of the employment law. But it's also for one reason that I think is absolutely crucial, and that is because it uses the data of yesterday and today to form decisions, not just in predictive technologies, but this is really around decisions around what is a good employer, what it means to be productive, what it means to, we are using data, which is obviously not neutral because data is the picture of society as it is, with the power infrastructure and with the social hierarchies that we've created so far, to inform the what we define as concepts of productivity, work, as Carissa was saying, what it means. We're using this data to define what is going to be driving the decisions from tomorrow. It's more increasingly so as algorithms have a policy function. They seem to have an editorial function. They seem to have a act as gateways in what we see and what we don't see. So I think we've got to think about the wider context of what are the risks of these systems, and then what is missing, I think, in the European legislation, but that probably requires a global level, and something which is I'm hoping in the Council of Europe, and they're doing an AI treaty based on a more sort of stringent human rights framework. But I'm also hoping in sort of global is that we've got to really understand what auditing AI system means, and we need to have some sort of more global understanding of the standards that we are going to require. And I know that talking about power, when we talk about standards and all of this, there are global power battles around standards and around all of that. But I think the culture of accountability and self-assessment of the European Act is great. We also need, I think, a an ecosystem of assurance and auditing that that enables this product to be audited by third parties and before they are put out in the market.
Thank you very much, Ivana. And I suppose as we near towards the sort of last stage of our session, I just wanted to give the other speakers a chance to reflect on what the next steps are. What do you think we need to make sure that we have that protection in place? I suppose Ivana's emphasised there the need for the sort of, I suppose, the importance of self-assessment models and the fact that they're a great first step to sort of take this a little bit further. What else is required in terms of getting that kind of those information asymmetries minimized and giving, I suppose, preventing some of the exacerbations of power inequalities and their sort of firming up through these systems? If I come first to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that gets to the heart of it. We've talked about some very dystopian elements of what happens when these things go wrong. And I think we're in a contestable space at the moment. We're in a contestable space over what is the power of technology and where can it take us. We're in a contestable space around what does the economy look like globally in each jurisdiction coming out of this pandemic, with different hopes and fears that lots of workers have had around that, and how does that all fit together? One of the things I always reflect on is that most of these AI tools that businesses are used are not designed by the businesses that use them. Most companies will not be big enough to build their own AI systems. It's through procurement. It's through systems built often in America or other parts of the world being then sold into European markets or other markets. And where does accountability and power lie within that? So I would say that any path that leads to a better future has to run through the rivers of power and accountability to get that right in different spheres. Because unless we make it accountable, in every generation, when there's been new forms of production, we've had this contestable space where it's actually been up to workers and activists and organisers and civic-minded human rights activists to put the limits of that on. And how do we create the rules for this new world? My hope would be we have learned as a human race enough now that we don't have to have that long, we can shorten that time until we get the balance right, which is why some of the EU stuff's really important. So what do I want to see? I want to see greater negotiation between employers and their workforces through works councils, unions and others, because this is about individual relationships and to me, ultimately about social partnership. What is good work? What is acceptable? How is our data used? And we're using GDPR as a union. It's then about how we do that in the economy, and good friends like Unison, the GMB are changing and transforming some of those relationships about how data is used in public services, because actually workers are really important voices in that public service data around it. An updated reset, we're campaigning for something called a right to disconnect, which isn't necessarily about the AI, but it's about what Carissa talked about, this always on culture, this pressure that we're always responding through digital technology or feeling we have to, and how that leads to discrimination. But we'd definitely call for a bit, we'd like to see a reset on this to get this right. And that's got to be around employment rights and putting humans in control of that so they're accountable. I think it's about upgrading GDPR and the AI laws like European Union's doing, so we get the technology fixed around that. And running, for me, really important. We've got to run the equality lens through this as well, because we know when it goes wrong, it goes horrifically wrong for some groups of people. And we have done nothing else from these last few years. We've got to learn enough is enough. Big tech developers cannot hide behind the technology when some of the harms they are doing are wrecking lives and causing outcomes for people which we would not accept in any other sphere of civic life.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. And any quick comments from yourself, Carissa, before I wrap up and close?
I think Ivana and Andrew are completely right in calling attention to the international aspect of this. We need a lot of diplomacy. It's a moment in which we really need an agreement like the Declaration of the Human Rights to make sure that the rights that we had online or offline we can have online. We need to resist as individuals whenever you can. Just resist being reduced to numbers or tracking or surveilled. And we need to ban the commodification of personal data. As long as personal data can be sold and bought, there will be very, very negative incentives to collect more of that data and to sell it to the highest bidder. And that's a huge problem.
That makes complete sense. Well, thank you all so much for such a fascinating conversation. I'm sure that the audience would join me in thanking you, Andrew, Ivana, and Carissa, for such brilliant contributions. We completely agree at the Institute for the Future of Work that there needs to be further actions in a legislative way, but then also with the follow-through institutional components to enable these protections to come in place to sort of mitigate the potential harms that could come from this increasing surveillance. So both, and we were sad to see that the employment bill wasn't raised, but believe that a schedule of digital rights is greatly needed to be developed in the UK, including some of the aspects such as Andrew's introduced in his summary. An Accountability for Algorithms Act, which would allow us to effectively begin to address the disconnection between accountability for the significant equality harms of data-driven technologies and the kind of privacy components that we've already begun talking about, and also making that shift towards recognising that it's not just citizens and consumers, but workers that are significantly impacted by these kinds of technological changes. And ultimately, really sort of ramping up disclosure obligations so that those information asymmetries are mitigated and that there can be a reduction of information asymmetries and beginning to create the spaces for auditing to be a more collaborative kind of environment with the workforce. Think about what the purpose of these technologies are and how it's actually helping to achieve what is needed. So thank you all again very much for taking part, and we look forward to speaking to you and hearing from you in the future. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks everyone for joining today's session on worker surveillance. We will be back at 12 o'clock looking at designing technology for a better future of work. Remember to keep involved in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag CogX and the @FutureWorkInst, which is FutureWorkInst. Thanks very much. See you at